When I was 13 years old, my mom and dad told me that they were sending me to summer camp for 2 weeks. I was a real homebody when I was that age, and I guess sending me to camp was their way of forcing me to develop social skills before I ended up with some kind of anxiety disorder or something. Looking back, I see why they did what they did. No parent wants to see their kid grow up some weird loner who ends up socially stunted and resentful of the world. I guess attending camp that summer really did make me a little bit more confident and able to handle people, but it definitely wasn't in the way they were expecting. To say I wasn't keen on attending the summer camp might be the understatement of the century. When my parents told me, I almost burst into tears right then and there. I promised that I'd do whatever it took to keep them from sending me to some wilderness torture for 2 weeks, that I'd improve my hygiene and try to be more sociable. But they weren't looking to bargain with me. They were giving me an order. I was going to summer camp whether or not I liked it, and if they had to drag me kicking and screaming onto the waiting bus, so be it. I'll be honest, I cried myself to sleep on the night before the departure day, and I was fighting back tears on the drive out to the bus that would eventually take us to camp. It was only when I was on the bus with the other kids that I was certain I wouldn't cry again, and even then, I think it was only because I was frozen in terror at being in the presence of a bunch of screaming teens. A trio of kids actually asked what my problem was, and all I could do was just sit there, gripped with fear as they began to discuss if I was special. It was completely humiliating, and I actually wondered if there was any way I could escape during a break at a roadside rest stop or something. But then, where would I go? What would I do? It was the very definition of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, and obviously, I chose the hard place over the rock. The first few days of camp were tough to say the least. I barely spoke to anyone, hated the food, and the activities were my idea of hell. I guess I have to say that I was spoiled in that respect, having eaten my choice of foods while sleeping in my very own bedroom, all as an only child. So the realities of eating fairly crappy food while sleeping in a cabin that slept 6 were a devastating shock to the system. My anxiety was bad enough during that first week, but it was particularly intense during meal times, and that was all down to the fact that the boys and girls camps shared a catering facility. It wasn't all the girls that made me so anxious either. It was one in particular, a girl named Alexandra. She was the prettiest girl I'd ever laid eyes on. Popular, smart, graceful, and confident. I spent almost all of lunch and dinner time staring in her direction, except of course when her gaze turned my way. Then I'd just stare into my dinner tray, hoping she hadn't spotted me looking at her. I somehow said twin prayers that she'd come waltzing up to me to say hello, while also hoping that she'd stay far away, that I didn't become some bumbling, red-faced idiot in front of her. Only one prayer was answered, and it made for one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. I'll never forget how sweet her voice sounded from up above me, how she asked if it was okay if she could sit with me for a few moments. I completely failed to give her an answer, but she was confident enough to just smile, giggle, and sit down opposite me, recognizing that I wanted to bask in her presence more than anything else in the world. I only managed to compose myself enough to speak once she started asking me my name and where I was from and that kind of thing. Hearing how curious she was about me and seeing the jealous looks of some of the other boys in the cafeteria, that was the first big confidence boost I'd ever gotten in my life. It didn't exactly tip me over the scales or anything. I was still socially backward and incredibly nervous, but for the rest of the day, it was like I was floating on cloud 9. The same thing happened at dinner the following evening, with Alexandra coming over to talk to me about this and that. Only that time, I actually managed something of a complete conversation. And then, towards the end of my first week, when I'd actually managed to buddy up with 2 other fairly geeky, socially awkward guys, she finally asked me the fateful question. Alex walked up to the table I was sitting with my 2 friends at and asked me if I wanted to meet her down at the swimming lake that evening before lights out. Now, as you can guess, something like that was completely and utterly forbidden by camp rules. The girls and the boys were not allowed to fraternize outside of permitted activities. or in the cafeteria, but then that's what made it so doubly special for me. She obviously liked me enough to risk getting sent home early and completely in disgrace, too. There was definitely a time when an opportunity to get sent home early would have been something that I'd have jumped on, but after meeting and talking to Alexandra, I didn't think that I ever wanted to go back home at all. The risk made it exciting, thrilling even, and as nervous as I was about meeting her in private, I told her, of course, then plotted how I'd make my way down to the lake without being spotted by any counselors. When the time came, my buddies wished me luck, gave me some advice on how to keep it cool and play it smooth. Then I set off down towards the lake to meet Alexandra. When I arrived, my heart sank when I saw that she was nowhere to be seen. I was convinced that she wouldn't show, that I'd gotten all my hopes up for nothing, but I was also terrified to just leave in case she showed up a little late and got the impression that I wasn't interested in her. I stayed for 5 minutes, then 10, then when I eventually heard someone approaching along the trail. Then, who should emerge from the trees but the object of my affections, Alexandra, and she was carrying 2 towels. As we talked, I was this mix of nervous and excited and terrified and joyous, but above all, it felt like some kind of victory. I could be sociable. I could date pretty girls. I could probably even be one of the popular kids if I put my mind to it, I thought. That might sound like my ego was inflating to dangerous levels, and you'd definitely be right about that. In fact, by the time Alexandra had actually showed up, it had inflated to the point where I couldn't see how our little meetup could possibly go wrong. And when she suggested we strip down to our underwear and go for a little swim, I was completely blinded by puppy love that I didn't stop to think how that might not be the best of ideas. We did strip down to our shorts, then edged off the dock and into the water. The water was cold, but that was a godsend in a way, because then I could pretend that I was shaking just because of how cold it was and not because I was absolutely overwhelmed with nerves at being in my underwear with such a pretty girl. We swam around for a while, trying to keep as quiet as possible, and at some point, Alexandra brought up that she loved swimming and that she swam competitively for the private school she attended back in Burlington. She told me that she could hold her breath for just short of a minute, that it was a record at her school or something like that, and asked if I wanted to see her prove it. I was happy to watch her do just about anything at that point, so of course I said yes. And when she sank under the water, I counted up to 52 seconds until she emerged, gasping for breath. I was beyond impressed. 52 seconds is an incredible feat, especially for a girl of her smaller stature. Then, she asked how long I could hold my breath for. I told her I didn't know, but I was only too happy to duck under the water so she could count how long I could hold it for. I remember ducking under the water and hearing her muffled sounds of counting loud in that sweet lyrical voice of hers. I counted along with it in my head, feeling my lungs beginning to burn for air as the seconds ticked over. But then, she suddenly stopped counting, right as I heard something enter the water next to me. I kicked my legs to push myself back to the surface so I could check out whatever or whoever it was, and that's when I felt a hand on top of my head, pushing me down and keeping me under the water as I tried to resurface for air. I remember opening my eyes to see that Alexandra was no longer in front of me, so whoever was keeping my head under the water was either behind me or above me on the dock. I began to panic, reaching up to pull the hand off my head, but I couldn't do it. I don't think I've been able to drag it off my head at the best of times, and I was always a fairly weak kid and the grip was strong. But then, since I was dangerously low on oxygen, it was completely impossible for me to even budge it. Within a couple more seconds, I could actually feel myself starting to black out. My lungs were on fire. It got harder and harder to struggle against the force pushing me down, and there came a moment where I actually thought to myself, I'm gonna die. The thought caused another spur of panic to run through me, but then after that, and this is the very final thing I remember before I must have passed out, was this weird feeling of peace and acceptance. I wasn't panicking anymore. I just sort of gave up trying to fight the feeling. Then, although I don't exactly remember it, I guess I just let myself drift off into oblivion. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the dock, coughing up water while an adult voice was asking me if I could hear them. I was still in a daze, and in that moment, I couldn't remember what had happened to me. I was just all confused and kind of sleepy. Then as I looked around, I saw Alexandra, crying while one of the counselors tried to comfort her. It was only then that I actually remembered the hand holding me under the water, how I'd gone from the happiest I'd ever been to thinking I was going to die. I had no idea who'd actually held me under, but Alexandra did, and her guilt had her fessing up to the counselor pretty quickly regarding who it was. Apparently, the whole thing had been an elaborate prank to screw with the nervous, overweight kid, but she had no idea that they were going to try to literally drown me out on the lake. From what I gathered, she'd panicked as soon as she saw them keep me under the water so long and had rushed off to get a counselor so they could stop it from happening. The EMTs and the cops showed up not long after I was taken into the head counselor's office, and as you can imagine, it became a huge deal. What was intended to be just some dumb, cruel prank had turned into what the cops were calling attempted murder. The kids did end up getting arrested and taken away from the camp that same night, and the kid who actually held my head down ended up going to juvie for a couple of years, believe it or not. Mom and Dad came to pick me up the next day too, and Mom gave the head counselor an earful about seeing them in court before basically shoving me into the car. I didn't cry when I went off to camp, but I cried having to leave it. It was a whole mix of emotions too. Happy to be leaving a place where I almost died, but sad to be leaving my first real friends behind, and sad to be leaving Alexandra behind too. I know she was the crux of the prank against me, and don't get me wrong, I definitely felt bitter about that. But she also cared enough to run to get help when she realized that they were trying to actually hurt me. I can't tell you how much that meant to me, and looking back, I do realize how crazy that sounds. But in my dumb 13-year-old brain, that was all the evidence I needed that she did actually like me in some way, even if it wasn't the way I wanted. In a bizarre way, nearly dying at that camp turned out to be one of the best things to ever happen to me. I realized that the worst thing in the world, death, wasn't actually all that bad a concept. When it comes to actually facing it, there comes a point of acceptance and peace, and after that, nothing really scared me anymore. I knew I could make friends. I knew I could be brave, and so the things that I thought I never could, like talk to girls or learn to skate, and I actually ended up losing a few pounds from actually going outside and socializing with the new friends I made at school through skating. The only big negative that came from it was my fear of deep water. I haven't gone swimming since that day, and the idea of going on a cruise or being out on a boat honestly makes me sweat with fear. Like I said, going to that camp helped me get over my social anxieties in a big way. It came at a cost, I suppose, but I still weirdly am glad I endured the whole experience, because now I'm not scared of that one thing that grips everyone else and sometimes dictates their whole lives. I'm not afraid of death, and I guess that helps me live a little more than others. I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by day's end, we'd planned the destination and date. Although I've been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck nor Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping. My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors has never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer, perhaps the most important of all the goods. We'd loaded up and were ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we had no idea what lay ahead of us, and how it would affect our connection to one another, a connection we once believed to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how dry the surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, wasn't my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn put the knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos to use, setting up the tent. I had purposely got the easiest tent I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd become obnoxious and loud when we got drunk, and more importantly, I like to make big bonfires and turn my music up loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. And despite the hangover, I resolved then and there it was something we were going to do much more often. When I finally drugged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up with the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. This made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed an armful of wood. When I returned, I set it down on the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly, and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their faces was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open, and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better and suggested that we go fishing. We didn't make it back to camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything that we could keep, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after, we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire. It would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we left for home. Most of the night, the 3 of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 in the morning, we decided to turn in, the beer long being drunk. My last memory was Chuck going out to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his bag, but eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to pee like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other 2. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell, similar to burned meat, hit me. I figured one or both of the guys were already up and burning our breakfast. I looked behind me, and only Glenn was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark for him. I looked up expecting to see my brother burning food, but was met with a sight far more serious and horrible than I could have ever imagined. The fire was burned out, and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up, within a few steps, and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then all of a sudden, it hit me what I was seeing. Chuck was lying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was black and smelled the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he didn't answer immediately, I ran into the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but when I yelled that Chuck was freaking dead, loudly in his face, he jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point toward the remnants of the fire and the horrible vision that the sun was making clearer by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him and silently with my eyes closed. Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrible smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when I first realized that I had peed myself. It didn't matter, though. With every second, the sight became clearer and I was too terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying myself. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what had happened. They arrived about an hour and a half later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned up the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to one of the officers. The smell was still so bad. I began retching and retreated back to the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent. We talked about the trips and events of the night before, nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later with the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp, and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from the terrible smell of my brother's burning flesh. Looking back on it now, I'll acknowledge that I may have looked a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of the family. I knew our mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate to another how to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling Mom was as bad as I had imagined. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens when Mom found them. Boys their age are usually hard to adopt out, but Mom had fell in love with them at first sight. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of my family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was on her. This was the first instance I began to get the feeling Glenn harbored suspicions towards me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his usual questioning look many times throughout that month. As the months passed and more questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention here, I had always assumed Chuck had passed out or tripped or fell into the fire, killing him. He had been much drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance. Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured. A worrying sign for sure, but even the doctors were forced to admit that things like this happen in a fire. A skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I tried to show him this is the wrong time to be apart, he convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations towards Glenn and his relationship with Chuck, more than once. I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. I do have my own suspicions. Yes, but now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us more than ever right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break her heart, it may actually just kill her. For the foreseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for our mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers, and if it led to Chuck's death, even if it yields something terrible, truth that I may not want to be aware of, I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother too.
So during my freshman year of college, I had a boyfriend who I had just broken up with, and as a young naive freshman in college, I was broken up about it. This was right around the time that I first met my stalker, Scott. Scott was weird as hell, and I really had no interest in him whatsoever. He was once outside my dorm building and he asked me a question. It was something along the lines of asking me out. I told him no and that I had a boyfriend, which was obviously a lie. I then proceeded to move on from that conversation and interaction and forgot all about Scott. That conversation took place in the fall semester. So right as the year was ending and I was finally back home for the summer, I received a Facebook message from Scott basically saying hi, which then proceeded to tell me that I needed to answer him or he would hurt me. I kid you not, he sent the same exact message over 100 times. Yes, I counted it. It was terrifying, and I called my mom and I told her what happened and how I barely know this guy, and that we only had a 1-2 second interaction. While I'm on the phone, he had started to write more messages, but these messages were different ones. It was as if he was having a conversation with me, but without me actually responding. One second he was telling me how much he loved me, and then the next was all about how he wanted to hurt me and how he was going to kill me. As you can imagine, after all that, I blocked him. At that point, my mom made me call the police, who came out and took a report, and they basically just told me to report him to the school. My dad ended up calling my school, and he told them that this guy shouldn't be in the same dorm building as me when I returned from fall semester. But they told him that until he physically hurts me, they can't do that. So until he actually went through with his threats, I had to just wait around and watch my back. So after blocking about 5 different pages from Scott, I didn't hear from him for the rest of the summer. Fall semester rolls around and I didn't see him the first couple of weeks. And then one day, right as I was eating in the cafeteria with one of my friends, he walks up behind me, places a gift bag on my table, and walks away. I tell my friend to throw it away, and she says no, she's gonna open it. I didn't want to open it because he then may have gotten the idea that I liked him, and at that point, he was totally psychotic in my opinion. She opens it up, and it's my 2 favorite candies, which how the hell did he even know that? After thinking about it, a few days later, I remembered that I had a model mayhem profile that stated my favorite candy. He obviously searched the internet for me. Anyways, there was also a letter stating that he was very sorry, blah blah blah. So after that day, it was quiet for a while. I would see him and he would always stare me down very creepily. You know how you stare out of the side of your eyes? Yeah, that kind of stare. So I decided to leave my school and transfer to another school that spring. After leaving, I received more messages from him, and I blocked profile after profile. He then tweeted me a bunch of random crazy threats, and somehow he had got my mom's phone number. My mom ended up contacting his mother, since that was the number he was calling from, and she found out why Scott was stalking me and sending me threatening messages. First and foremost, his mom said that Scott was 26, which is really crazy to think that they allowed a 26-year-old to live in dorms with 17 and 18-year-olds. I think college apartments should be for 26-year-olds. Heck, I'm 28 now, and I would never live in a dorm room. Anyways, she also found out that Scott had schizophrenia, and when he didn't take his meds, he would hear my voice in his head. Reminder, I only met this guy once. We had a very small interaction, and after that, never even spoke again. How could my voice be stuck in his head? She then proceeded to say that she would make sure he took his medication so that he would no longer contact me. I decided that this was enough and that I needed to get an order of protection against him to have some sort of protection legally. Not that it would make him stay away. It was more of a protection in my head, and I never did hear from him again. So Scott, if you happen to hear this and you know who you are, I sincerely hope that you never contact me again.